Right, so last time I made a video on Come Dine With Me, we looked at a contestant called Heather, who is undoubtedly one of the show's worst sore losers of all time. At the end of the video, I said that if you guys enjoyed it, I'd definitely make another one, and by far the most requested episode was the one with Peter, Jane, and the most iconic rant in the show's history. Now, I've seen the clip of Peter's rant at Jane so many times. It's always popping up on my Twitter timeline, being reposted by Instagram meme pages, or going viral on TikTok. But for all the times that I've seen the episode's extraordinary climax, I've never actually seen the full thing. I'd always assumed it was going to be another typical storyline where an unpalatable character goes off on a hilariously melodramatic rant after losing the competition, just like Heather did. However, far from the classic cliche that I expected, this 40-minute reality show episode actually turned out to be one of the most complex and exhilarating villain origin stories in British TV history. What made it so spectacular was, rather than the inevitable self-destruction of a born villain in the presence of a hero, the villain's tragic downfall was in fact intentionally and ruthlessly orchestrated by another villain. A villain so clinical that they managed to sell their narrative to the entire country, perhaps undeservedly cementing their status as a mere victim of an unprovoked, unjustified, and disproportionate verbal bombardment by a self-entitled narcissist. But today, we're going to uncover the truth. We're going to explore the episode's key moments to see how this dramatic tale came to pass and find out for ourselves who the true villain of this iconic episode really is. So get your popcorn out, because this one is a classic. First to be introduced was Peter, the episode's infamous antagonist, an ostentatious salesman with an undeniably overinflated ego.
I'm a salesman, which makes me ultimately competitive. I expect other people to do things the way I would do it, and if they're not, I wonder why they're not as good.
The second contestant and the first host of the episode was Charlotte, who is basically the human equivalent of a golden retriever.
My menu this evening is the winning menu, so it's good, simple food, and people are going to walk out the door with a smile on their face, so full of happiness, and I'm going to win.
Also on this episode was brainy university student Adam, a top bloke with a cracking sense of humour and an uncanny resemblance to Louis Theroux.
I'd say I'm a little bit of a nerd. I think you just kind of can tell looking at me. I think my friends would probably describe me as hopefully funny, lanky, awkward, showing an increasing amount of grey hair at an inappropriately young age.
Never did George Clooney any harm.
Whereas I'd prefer to be a sort of Brad Pitt type sex symbol.
Last time we spoke about how producers seem to have a knack for finding people that absolutely despise each other. And they managed to do it again with the episode's fourth and final contestant, Jane, a police detective and soon to be Peter's arch nemesis.
I'm a bit naughty, I'm a bit cheeky, I give as good as I get. I generally do like to chip in and try and offend and shock as much as I can.
And so here we have the root of friction between our two lead roles. The arrogant, delusional Peter with his superiority complex, and Jane, a power-hungry sociopath hell-bent on humbling others and asserting her power over them to the fullest extent permitted by law. Charlotte and Adam, of course, were mere pawns in this tale, just innocent bystanders whose malleable minds facilitated the manipulation of the episode's controversial narrative. Well, with the introductions out the way, it was finally time for our four contestants to meet each other. First up to host an evening was Charlotte, and to help everyone get to know each other better, she proposed an icebreaker where everyone had to guess each other's age.
We don't want to be friends with each other, so let's get started this way.
I reckon you're about 27?
28.
31?
I'm 24 years old. As of like 3 weeks ago, I'm 24. Classic game of Guess the Age, the game that will never hurt anyone's feelings ever. Oh, except mine.
Nice to have someone on the channel who looks older than they actually are to balance things out a bit. The banter was definitely in full flow early on, and it really brought everyone's personalities out. Adam had quite a British self-deprecating sense of humour, so he took all of the banter pretty well, and he didn't really have any problem getting along with any of the others. Charlotte, I think, was a bit too harmless to be seen as competition, and was perhaps a little bit too absent-minded to notice any of the sly comments that came her way. The only ones who seemed to take any of it seriously were Peter and Jane, Jane, whose fragile egos couldn't resist biting at the smallest offerings of bait, and the first little nibble came only a few hours into the night. While Charlotte was plating up the main course, the others had a classic rummage around the house, and they stumbled across a photo of Charlotte playing football. This sparked a conversation about sports and led to the drawing of the first blood.
Yeah, because the only sports I know, none.
Pie eating.
Oh, thanks.
That's how you make friends on the first night.
So it was actually Jane that struck first. I think Peter was showing some humility here, making a self-deprecating joke, but Jane really capitalised on it. Peter only dropped his guard for the briefest of moments, but he got hit by the old 1-2 and it rocked him. He laughed it off, and fair play to him because it was quite a harsh joke to take from someone you've just met. But that was it. His guard went back up and it didn't go back down again. That one moment where he showed glimpses of having a likeable side, of someone who doesn't take themselves too seriously, made him vulnerable. And he didn't make that mistake again.
I was going to make a comment about a fat ass. I didn't, and I was good.
The slight dig behind closed doors was equally unnecessary, but it showed that Peter wasn't going to go down without a fight. If Jane was going to take cheap shots whenever the opportunity arose, he was more than happy to stoop down to her level. At the end of the night, after some average food and mildly uncomfortable conversation, Charlotte scored a 7 from Adam and Jane and a 6 from Peter, leaving her with a less than mouth-watering 20 out of 30. On the second night, it was Adam's turn to host. And this time, the conversation got a little bit deeper. Peter ended up saying that if he had the option to, he would remove speed limits from all motorways, and Jane did not approve.
In this country, because we have the congestion that we have, you have to enforce a speed limit, because otherwise people will just kill themselves.
Jane has opinions and they're not going to shift. If you don't agree with them, I'm not so sure she would cope with that particularly well.
The problem is they don't know what my job is, do they? Don't make ridiculously stupid comments like that when you've got absolutely no concept of what you're talking about.
It was very reductive of a complicated argument, but more significantly, very dismissive of what is perhaps not as unreasonable an opinion as she made it out to be. As the evening went on, Jane's frustrations continued to build, and her dislike for Peter became more and more evident. The harsh comments made in the first night could arguably have been passed off as being made in jest, but now they were very clearly no longer being masked by humour.
I would probably like to run the country.
Oh God, really?
Do you think I'd make a good Prime Minister?
No.
Not an unreasonable opinion, and I'm not sure many would disagree, but she's not saying it just to disagree with him, is she? She knows how that response is going to make him feel. It's clearly something he's thought about before, and clearly something he believes in, and that once again made him vulnerable, giving Jane the perfect opportunity to belittle him for it. First she ridicules him with the "oh God, really?" and then she drives a metaphorical stake through his heart with the condescending "no." By this point, Jane's tone was manifestly darker. She was purposefully making him feel small and grinding away at him piece by piece. But still, he says nothing in return.
If Peter was Prime Minister, I'll probably move to a different country, if I'm honest with you.
I am very good at getting what I want done. I think I would make a very good Prime Minister.
Whatever you might think of how Jane was being, Peter doesn't half make it easy for her, does he? He is the closest thing to David Brent I think I've ever seen in the real world. He's deluded, he's far too overconfident, and he's completely blind to his own flaws. But just like when I watched The Office, I pity him for some reason. And I think Adam and Charlotte did too. Despite Jane's increasing dislike for Peter, they seem to be getting along fine with him, although they didn't struggle to identify just how fragile the pairing was.
I think he's a lovely person, but I don't think he would take criticism very well.
Well, by the end of the night, Adam's food had scored him a 7 from Charlotte, an 8 from Jane, and a measly 5 from Peter, leaving him joint top with Charlotte on a mere 20 out of 30. With Peter not impressed at what he had seen so far, he very much now saw Jane as being the only thing standing in the way between him and the £1,000 cash prize.
I am an infinitely better cook than anything I've seen so far. Jane's the one to beat at the moment.
And on the third night, he had his chance to assess his main competition because it was finally Jane's turn to host. The group by this point really didn't have a lot of chemistry, and a lot of the dinner conversations were very awkwardly dry. So to get them through the evenings, they kept on playing these icebreakers. And every single time, Peter and Jane used them to fire increasingly offensive shots at each other. This time, the game was lookalikes, and as you can imagine, they weren't particularly flattering.
Do you know who you remind me of? Beaker from Sesame Street.
No. Jane, I think you look like Victoria Beckham. Just putting that out there. You could probably make 2 Victoria Beckhams. No, Victoria Beckham is tall, thin, brown hair. Jane does not look like Victoria Beckham in any way.
You can tell that Peter was still wounded by the 2 jokes that Jane made about his weight on the first night, and I think this was retaliation for that. It was still rude and completely unjustified, but had Jane not started it, I don't think Peter would have come close to joking about her weight. Inevitably though, Jane wasn't going to leave Peter's taunt unanswered, and next up, it was her turn to pick his celebrity lookalike.
A little bit of an older James Corden, maybe.
I don't suppose Corden's too happy either.
Looking like James Corden offends me, because that's minging.
James Corden's not a particularly bad looking guy, but he's someone who's admitted that he's always struggled with his weight, and that's clearly why Peter took it so badly. The pair were at each other's throats all night, and whilst Peter dealt his fair share of rude jokes definitely intended to offend, I think Jane was the worst of the 2. So many times the banter would go backwards and forwards before coming to an end, and she'd reignite it for no reason. As she said at the start, she likes to shock and offend people, but she's up against someone who's not exactly afraid to take it too far themselves, and it makes for such a volatile mix. Like I said before, Charlotte was too nice to say anything, and was perhaps a bit too away with the fairies to really dwell on any of Jane's slightly harsher comments, and Adam's sense of humour allowed him to shrug things like the Beaker comparison off, but Peter just couldn't help but rise to it. Most of it was relatively humorous, but as the night went on, Jane was increasingly jumping on any opportunity to shut down Peter's opinions, and began patronising and ridiculing him a lot more frequently, and it was really hard to not feel sorry for him. Occasionally though, he would come out with quite a ludicrous opinion that Jane had every right to criticise, like this one.
I think everybody prostitutes themselves a little bit.
What's he talking about now?
What do you mean? I don't get it.
You'll all try a bit harder to get a nicer birthday present or a Christmas present.
I just think that's utter rubbish.
I think everybody puts out a little bit more to get what they want in life.
He's just got some very, very, very odd opinions.
Quite a spectacular dress sense too. His lime shirt and white trousers actually match the living room, and I don't know which one's more striking. Despite the bubbling tensions between the 2 though, on Jane's night of hosting, he was actually quite fair to her, and even complimented her food.
Damn, it's lovely. There's something really, really dirty about runny poached eggs that everybody loves. I want to say it's really, really nasty, but that would be lying, because it's really, really good.
Is it?
You can tell Peter's a foodie, can't you? For the entire week, almost all he spoke about when commenting on the evening at hand was the quality of the food. He didn't care about the entertainment or the social atmosphere, he just cared about how the food tasted and how it was presented. And despite having a stubborn dislike for Jane, he was refreshingly honest about hers, scoring her a very generous 8 out of 10 for the evening. With Jane cooking up the highest scoring 3-course meal of the week, Peter had an impressive 22 out of 30 points to beat if he were to taste victory. But he was up for the challenge, cooking a slow roasted rib of beef for main, a cheesecake for starter, and a pecorino salad for dessert.
Go on, have a quick lick of the spatula. I said a quick lick, fella. Oh, good gracious me.
In the last video, we spoke about how it's always a tough one having to host last. There's always a chance that on the last night, all of the tension that's been building up over the week could reach boiling point and be released in a dramatic explosion of fights, arguments and fallouts. There's also a chance that the person that thinks that they're the current leader of the competition ends up sabotaging it by either giving the final host an unfairly low score, or even worse, ruining the evening on purpose. And that, I submit, is exactly what happened here. Unmoved by Peter's integrity and honesty during her night of hosting, Jane saw a golden opportunity to deal a devastating blow to Peter's hopes of winning the competition. With the week coming to a close, the 4 of them began speaking about their first impressions of each other and how their opinions changed as time went on. Peter started off and actually spoke about Charlotte really nicely.
My opinion of you hasn't changed since the first moment I met you.
Okay.
And that was that you were warm, honest, caring.
So quite a nice start to the conversation. Perhaps a few too many buttons undone, but a nice start nonetheless. However, Jane then decided to speak about Peter, and she was nasty. She had taken things a little bit too far a couple of times before this, but this was bad.
You're a very confident human being, very confident human being. You like the finer things in life, don't you? You do, Peter, you do. We've got, like, this little pepper thing on the table. I've got a grinder.
My life is as generically ordinary as everybody else's. I just happen to have more nice clothes than most people.
Okay.
Questionable statement, but regardless of his dress sense, this was horrible from Jane. It was like she was maliciously trying to hurt his feelings, and she was so patronising with the way she said everything. She also didn't seem like she was willing to stop until she completely broke him.
The way that you've presented yourself, you have led us to believe that you are quite a sort of pompous human being. Sorry.
I don't think I am in any way pompous.
Once again, it was hard to not pity him here. He had been battling it out with Jane up until this point, but it had never really been this deep. Making mean jokes was one thing, but to sit there and tear into someone at their own dinner party for that long, it was quite difficult to watch. There wasn't even a hint of humour or jest in anything she was saying. It was straight up bullying. Obviously Peter had been rude himself at points and definitely deserved to get it as good as he gave it, but this was just way too much. That being said though, I would have felt worse for him if his response wasn't quite so savage.
I'm actually quite offended now. Jane, would you prefer it if someone said to you, well, you behave like a fat troll and you didn't make much... How would it feel to you?
It was such an awkward scramble of a question, wasn't it? He clearly only asked it to essentially call her a fat troll in response. He could have held the higher ground and gained some respect for taking it well, but instead he decides to sink down to her level. She had been slowly grinding away at his morale since day one. She made those 2 fat jokes on the first night, she ridiculed his aspirations of becoming Prime Minister, she compared him to James Corden, she belittled his opinions and his beliefs and everything he was saying, and then on the last night she finally broke him by dismantling his personality piece by piece at his own dinner party. But with this one little outburst, he fulfilled the prophecy that she had created for him, and became the villain of the story. And Adam and Charlotte just sat there, stuck in the middle of it all. I feel like one of them should have stepped in and been like, this is getting out of hand, but I think they were both just too meek for it. Instead, they just sat there digesting the narrative that Jane had created, and even took some flack to the face in the crossfire.
Dessert was annoyingly nice. That was probably the best part of his whole meal. Your food has been sublime.
I put so much effort into this to make it special for you, not for those 2. I knew the other 2 were here for the experience, but not you. You were here to win, and I wanted to show you I was worthy of your competition.
And it's so clear that that's all he wanted. Just a slither of acceptance or appreciation, and maybe things would have been different. He's kind of like Anakin Skywalker in Revenge of the Sith or Commodus in Gladiator. The arrogant sense of entitlement to the Jedi Council, to the throne of Rome, to first place in Channel 4's Come Dine With Me. They were all self-created heights for them to fall from. But unlike Mace Windu or Marcus Aurelius, Jane's part to play in delivering the rejection was inexcusable. Anakin wasn't ready to be a Jedi Master, and Commodus wasn't fit to rule Rome. But Peter deserved to have his night. He deserved to have the opportunity to serve up his 3-course meal to a trio of open-minded guests, just like the 3 had done before him. But rather than making an effort to enjoy the evening and contribute to a civilized social environment, rating the food fairly and then bringing up her criticisms at the unveiling of the results, Jane robbed Peter of any hopes he might have had of winning the competition by completely spoiling the atmosphere of the evening. And then, to make her actions even more contemptible, she had the audacity to sit there and shamelessly pretend that it wasn't her intention.
It wasn't meant for you to feel deflated and sad and miserable. That's not my intent.
Well, that's how it came across.
Okay, well, you shouldn't feel like that. You shouldn't.
I should feel like
you
that
shouldn't.
Because that's how I feel.
But you shouldn't, sweetheart. You shouldn't.
And he was right there too, regardless of how she intended it to come across. That's how he took it. She can't sit there and say that he shouldn't have felt a certain way about her words and actions, because he did. Even if she wasn't sorry for what she said, the bare minimum would have been to apologise for the way that it made him feel. But she wasn't sorry for that either, because that's exactly what she intended. And instead of apologising, she rubbed salt deeper into the wounds by being patronising and calling him sad and miserable. She straight up bullied him for 2 minutes straight, and then tried telling him how he should feel about it.
To sit there in someone else's home and rip into them is appalling.
That was pretty much the end of the main course, so Peter packed up the plates and stormed off. He returned with dessert, but any sweetness was cut by the bitterness of the evening's fallout. And so, after scoring the final evening, the 4 competitors gathered round in the living room to find out who had won.
In 4th place is me.
Why are you shaking your head at me?
You won, Jane.
Oh my God.
Enjoy the money. I hope it makes you very happy. Dear Lord, what a sad little life, Jane.
I don't know why you're shaking your head at me, as if she doesn't know. She orchestrated this downfall from day one. She might have pulled the wool over Adam and Charlotte's eyes, but not Peter's. And ours no longer. He's called her out for it, and she's stuck looking at the floor like a kid who's just been caught with their hand in the cookie jar. And Charlotte and Adam are sat beside her like 2 schoolmates who have to awkwardly endure the scene of their host being reprimanded by a parent.
You ruined my night completely so you could have the money, but I hope now you spend it on getting some lessons in grace and decorum, because you have all the grace of a reversing dump truck without any tyres on.
To this day, I still have no idea how he came up with that on the spot. It is literal poetry. And watching this freak out back now with the context of the full episode, it makes sense. She did ruin his night so she could have the money. She does need to spend it on some lessons in grace and decorum. She was the real villain all along.
I don't get it.
Well, you wouldn't, let's be honest. There's nobody in there, love.
I'm not quite sure why he started sending for Charlotte like that. What happened to the warm, honest, caring person he liked so much? I always knew he thought she was a bit of a divvy. He just didn't want to say it. And also, to top it all off with that little glance at the camera, it is office-esque and it is beautiful.
So Jane, take your money and get off my property.
And there we have it, the most iconic Come Dine With Me freakout of all time. In case you were curious, Jane actually scored Peter a reasonable 7 out of 10 for the evening, but her effect on the atmosphere resulted in Charlotte giving him a score of just 4, and Adam putting the final nail in the coffin by scoring him a brutally low 3 out of 10, leaving Peter in 4th position on just 14 points. In no way is Peter the hero of this story, and he's definitely not undeserving of criticism, but it's clear to see that his villain origin story is not a simple one, and far from Jane being merely one of 3 innocent victims on the receiving end of this vicious tirade, she was in fact, in my view at least, intentionally the cause of his widely vilified concluding remarks. But as they say, history is written by the victors, and Jane is the author of a story where Peter is the villain and she is the hero. While the truth may lie in a story somewhere in between, Jane's story is the bestseller. But the next time you see this clip, I hope you remember this video, and how this man, whose fate lay finely balanced on the edge of a knife, was tipped over to the dark side by Jane, the architect of his downfall, and in my opinion, the one true villain of this iconic episode. Unfortunately, that is the end of today's video, so if you enjoyed it, please feel free to subscribe down below so you can catch my next Come Dine With Me video as soon as I upload it. As always, the links to my Instagram, Twitter and other social media will be down below so you can come say hi in between uploads. And I would just like to say a very big thank you to all of my Patreons and channel members. I really appreciate your support. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.